In this series, we've gone over all the cards banned in the commons only format Pauper and discussing why they're banned and if they can be unbanned today. This video will go through some of the cards that were banned after already existing for an extended time in the Pauper metagame, as opposed to cards that were banned early into their lifespans. First off, we have Invigorate. This instant costs 2 generic and 1 green mana. If you control a forest, you may have an opponent gain 3 life instead of paying Invigorate's mana cost. Invigorate gives target creature plus 4 power and toughness until end of turn. It was banned from Pauper in February of 2013. Now, why was Invigorate banned? This card only saw play in decks built around the mechanic Infect. Creatures with Infect deal damage to creatures in the form of -1/-1 counters and to players in the form of poison counters. While this means your opponent doesn't take direct damage, if any player has 10 poison counters, they immediately lose the game. Infect inherently rewards players playing pump spells due to the deck focusing on dealing 10 damage as fast as possible. But what pushed Invigorate over the top for the strategy is the spell is completely free in Infect. Gaining the opponent 3 life would usually dampen the impact of dealing 4 extra damage with a creature outside of using it as a combat trick. However, considering Infect does not care about your opponent's life total at all, Invigorate could gain your opponent 10 life and still have seen just as much play. Coupled with Glistener Elf as a 1-drop Infect creature, Invigorate allowed these decks to pressure for lethal swings on turn 2 or 3 with optimal hands. One of the primary weaknesses of an all-in aggro deck is the inability to develop your mana. Infect will generally try and run the most efficient spells possible to maximize the number of early lethal hands. Invigorate pushes any 1-power creature to 5, which is half the poison counters needed to kill someone. And since Invigorate doesn't cost any mana, you're free to cast more pump spells, some of which will also not cost mana, like Mutagenic Growth. Infect was one of the better decks in the format at the time of Invigorate's banning, although it notably was not the best deck. Storm was still running rampant at the time, a deck discussed in a previous episode of the series. In fact, Invigorate was banned alongside the first Storm bans out of concerns that Infect would be far too dominant in the post-Storm format now that it was no longer checked by Grapeshot, and just generally outclassed by the combo deck. Could Invigorate be unbanned? Yes. After the banning of Invigorate, Infect instantly fell off from competitive deck to a rogue option. While Infect still exists and sees play to this day, it is by no means the threat it used to be. Pauper has become a generally more efficient format, dominated by aggro decks that leverage cards like Experimental Synthesizer to make up on card advantage instead of explosive turns. Not only does Infect's playstyle fit with the current expectations of Pauper with fast stacks threatening early, high damage attacks, it's arguably far less resilient than these currently legal options. Pauper lacks any real evasive Infect attackers beyond Blighted Agent, which costs 2 mana and requires you to run a second color, both factors that slow the deck down considerably in practice. As such, the Infect player generally needs to not only assemble 10 or more damage, they need to give their creature some means of not being blocked, or dealing damage despite being blocked. While cards like Rancor give a creature trample, meaning any excess damage dealt after killing a creature in combat is dealt to your opponent, they force Infect to draw more specific cards. Invigorate does not help this weakness, instead aiding on mana efficiency. Having access to Invigorate would allow the deck to threaten damage faster, but not shore up too many of the deck weaknesses that keep it fair. Infect also generally needs a way to protect their creature, given how all-in the strategy is. Without a spell like Snakeskin Veil to counter any target removal, it doesn't matter how big Invigorate makes the creature. Infect is a generally flimsy yet iconic aggro deck that could benefit from a boost without overtaking the meta any more than something like Kuldotha Red or Affinity, which are both fast aggro decks that trade off sheer speed of Infect for more resilience or card advantage. Infect could arguably add more variety to the meta, and would be hampered by the control decks in the format that have arguably never been stronger. Next up is Cloudpost. This land is a locust and enters the battlefield tapped. It can be tapped to add 1 colorless mana for each locust on the battlefield. It was banned from Pauper format in October of 2013. Why was Cloudpost banned? Even though it enters tapped, Cloudpost represents a mana generation engine that's both easy to get going and produces tons of mana. While there's only 1 other actual locust in Glimmerpost, even just 8 locust lands is enough if you have ways to search them. With even just 1 other locust, a Cloudpost is now on par with Ancient Tomb, which is among the most powerful lands ever printed. The locust engine was powerful enough that Cloudpost was eventually banned in Modern, and remains a powerful strategy to this day in Legacy. While Pauper lacked the higher rarity ways of getting more loco on the battlefield, like Vesuva, it still provided far too much mana for too little investment. Pauper has no shortage of high mana value spells to be ramped into. To make matters worse, Glitterpost's ability to gain life for each locust on the battlefield whenever it enters the battlefield would help stave off aggro decks and recover in the mid to late game. While Frantic Search had already been banned at this point, there were other ways of untapping lands to even further cheat on mana with Cloudpost, such as Snap. Could Cloudpost be unbanned? No. Pauper currently has access to Urza's Power Plant and the other Urza lands that make up a mana engine commonly known as Tron. Tron is one of the best decks of the format, able to produce a large amount of mana as long as it has at least one of each of the specific named lands on the battlefield. This is harder to assemble than the Locust lands, since as long as you have a Cloudpost, it doesn't matter what the other lands are as long as they're a Locust. Given that Tron has been successful for years and remains a competitive deck to this day, it's hard to imagine a world where Cloudpost decks wouldn't do basically the same thing, but better. With Tron, if you remove even just one of the names with targeted land destruction, the other lands lose all extra benefits. However, as long as you've got more than one Cloudpost, it's hard to outright deny your mana engine. While you technically had less lands for the Cloudpost engine than the Tron engine, and thus a lower ceiling, in practice, the more streamlined packages makes for more consistent hands. There would be little reason to run Tron over Cloudpost in the format, and if a card being unbanned would completely invalidate one of the most consistently good decks in the format, it's hard to imagine actually unbanning it. Cloudpost is a card that is generally seen as fair in Legacy and far too good in Modern, and unlikely to ever be unbanned there. It's just simply too far out of the power level of Pauper to ever realistically come back, especially since the cards have been banned specifically to limit Tron, and would have been even more problematic with Cloudpost in the format. How could Cloudpost be fixed to be unbanned? Given that Cloudpost works off of the number of loci on the field, the most straightforward way reigning in its power would be to make Cloudpost legendary. Not only would it make the maximum number of loci on the battlefield at any given time go down from 8 to 5, it would make it so only one locust could produce that mana. This would drastically limit the power of the loci, making them more likely an addition to current Tron decks potentially, instead of outright replacing them. The next two cards serve a similar function and were banned within the same year, so will be discussed together. First is Cloud of Faeries, which costs 1 generic and 1 blue mana for a fairy with 1 power and toughness, and the keyword abilities Flying and Cycling. Flying makes it so only other creatures with Flying or Reach can block it, and Cycling allows you to pay 2 generic mana and discard Cloud of Faeries to draw a card. This was rarely used, however, given that Cloud of Faeries has the ability to untap up to 2 lands whenever it entered the battlefield. It was banned in January 2016. Peregrine Drake costs 4 generic and 1 blue mana for a Drake with 2 power, 5 toughness, and the keyword Flying. It untapped up to 5 lands whenever it enters the battlefield and was banned in November 2016. Why were they banned? Both of these cards on paper refund their cost outright, with the 2 mana Cloud of Faeries untapping 2 lands and the 5 mana Drake untapping 5 lands. However, there are many ways to abuse these effects to get ahead on mana. Before it was banned, Cloudpost was a frequent target for both of these untap effects. A cycle of creatures with abilities that reduce the cost of specifically colored spells, such as Sunscape Familiar, made them both cost 1 less, making them even cheaper to cast, yet still untapping the same number of lands. But what pushed these synergies from just powerful bursts of mana that could support other decks into a dedicated combo deck was the prevalence of flicker effects in the format. Ghostly Flicker could make both of these creatures leave and re-enter the battlefield instantly, triggering more untaps and freeing up more mana. Familiars could use Cloud of Faeries and Peregrine Drake as a way to fuel a turn where they'd cast Capsize several turns in one turn with all the extra mana and bounce away all of your opponent's permanents. As other decks like Storm and Infect were banned out of the format, Familiars remained relatively unchecked and quickly became the most dominant threat in the format. Cloud of Faeries was banned first, in part because it saw even further utility in blue aggro decks thanks to its synergy with Spellstutter Sprite. However, it's important to note that a larger reason in Peregrine Drake's escape and abandon initially might have been its inclusion in Internal Masters, which at the time of Cloud Faeries banning was still an upcoming set. Wizards decided to not ban the card right as about to see a reprint, opting to see if only having one untapper with a much higher mana value would be enough to limit the deck. However, Peregrine Drake proved more than competent as a solo act in Pauper, to a point where it was banned not even a full year later. Even builds that didn't rely on the familiar package saw great success, with dedicated combo builds able to eventually draw through their whole deck in one turn. Ghostly Flicker could target Peregrine Drake and Mnemonic Wall to untap 5 lands and put Ghostly Flicker back in your hand with the walls enter the battlefield effect. Since Ghostly Flicker only costs 3 mana and Peregrine Drake untap 5 lands, you generate infinite mana. Then start flickering the wall and a permanent that draws cards like Muldrifter. Given that combo builds consistently could pull this off with Peregrine Drake, there was little room for it left in the format. After a few months of experimenting, Peregrine Drake was finally banned. Familiars even still see play without their most effective combo piece, often slotted into new variations of the flickering strategy. Could Cloud of Faeries or Peregrine Drake be unbanned? The answer to this is probably no. In the years since their banning, the options for flicker strategies have only gotten stronger. Ephemerate is a 1-mana flicker spell with the ability to recast itself for free in your next upkeep. This means you can use the initial flicker for your Peregrine Drake, then use the rebounded upkeep copy to flicker Augur or Bolas, or even flicker the Drake again if you have an instant speed use for the mana provided by the untapping. Flicker is already a powerful strategy in the format, able to leverage Murmuring Mystic as a secondary win condition option. Cloud of Faeries would have arguably even more impact on the format, since its lower mana value and synergy with fairy strategies would make it even less of an investment to run and build around than Peregrine Drake. The most surprising thing about these two is they last in the format for so long, although they can likely be attributed to living in the shadow of Storm. Much like the fellow banned card Frantic Search, these spells that refund themselves just are generally too powerful for the power level of Pauper. Pauper has just enough tools to break the cards, but not enough tools to really dampen and limit these combos like other formats would beyond the classic counterspell. As such, unless Pauper sees some radical shifts in power level and dynamics, it's unlikely these two cards could ever be unbanned. How could they be fixed to be unbanned? The most straightforward answer is to reduce the number of lands both cards untap. Instead of refunding their entire mana value, they could refund around half, with Cloud of Faeries untapping 1 land and Peregrine Drake untapping 2 or 3. This would drastically diminish their ability to be abused, but still leave some of their function as a valuable flicker target. Notably, if Drake can untap 3 lands, this is just enough to pay for Ghostly Flicker repeatedly with the previously mentioned combo. And while it will not generate infinite mana, it does allow you to cast a spell an infinite number of times, and get infinite enters and leaves the battlefield triggers. Balancing cards that untap lands is a tightrope walk, especially in a form like Pauper. If they're too overcorrected, they lose all of their original identity and become unplayable, but just too efficient and they become game-breaking. The next shakeup to Pauper as a format came in the form of 3 bans on the same day, all targeting the same type of strategy but multiple different decks on paper. While these cards were all played together, each were powerful in their own unique ways and should be discussed separately. First, we have Gush. This instant costs 4 generic and 1 blue mana, but can also be cast instead by returning 2 islands you control to your hand. This spell draws 2 cards and was banned in May of 2019. Why was Gush banned? Gush is a card so powerful and complex in its use cases that someone has genuinely written a full-length book theorizing how to best play it. While a 5 mana draw 2 is borderline unplayable in a world with divination, a 0 mana draw 2 that sometimes has more upsides than downsides is extremely playable. If you haven't made your land drop per turn before casting Gush, then you can replay one of those lands and then have 1 extra mana to work with that turn despite having less lands on board. Gush can also be used when digging for interaction, floating the mana you'd need for a counterspell, then hoping to draw it with Gush. It does put you behind on lands, and while that's certainly a notable downside, it's usually worth trading off for the value Gush offers, especially in the mid to late game where you have more than enough lands on board and don't really care about bouncing a couple. Or those times where you hold up interaction and your opponent doesn't play anything and you hardcast the Gush in their end phase. It allowed for both slower and more aggressive blue decks to refill their hands, with slow decks able to buy the time to rebuild, and aggressive or combo-oriented decks often would try to end the game before the mana deficit mattered. Gush only really struggled in the very early game, and even then it would still be cast in a pinch when the right situation presented itself. While any blue deck could reasonably run it, Delver of Secret decks were the most dominant users of Gush. These decks would go all in on their small, aggressive threats and protect them with counter magic as they grinded their opponent out. Gush was a massive aid in refueling the hands of Delver players after an expensive turn interacting or in the middle of trying to save a Delver. All 3 of the May 2019 bans would address Delver in some way or another, with Gush aimed to not only limit its draw power, but to reign in blue in general. It had been seen as dominant in the format, and Gush was a key part in what made blue so above the grade of Pauper standards. Could Gush be unbanned? The answer to this is probably no. Gush is one of the most powerful draw spells ever printed. It remains banned in Legacy and restricted in Vintage to this day. A free draw to an instant speed by itself is enough to be far too good, but Gush's downside isn't even always a downside, to a point where when leveraged correctly, it can be a massive swing in advantage even though it sets you back 2 lands behind your opponent. Pauper has access to plenty of powerful draw options that are much fairer. Lorien Revealed is a more recent 5 mana draw spell that draws 3 cards, and while its mana cost can't be cheated, its early game utility comes from having island cycling. You can pay 1 generic and discard to search a library for an island, allowing you to fix your mana in the early game and draw cards in the mid to late game. While much weaker than Gush, it has seen plenty of play since its printing. And with cards like Muldrifter as consistent staples of the format, there's no urgency to bring back Gush to the format. Pauper has plenty of card draw without including one of the most powerful draw spells ever that just so happened to have a common printing. How could Gush be fixed to be unbanned? Gush is an extremely powerful card that finds its main strength in its most unique gimmick. If you remove its alternative casting cost, then Gush would be a fairly unplayable draw spell. Instead, it might be more fair if Gush had to bounce 2 untapped islands instead of just any 2 islands. making it more of a hit to your mana advantage to actually cast the spell for free. Or if you didn't want to limit it in that way, you could make it need to bounce more lands. At 3 or 4 lands bounce, it would be much harder to consistently be able to justify casting it for free. Gush might even still be playable if it only bounced 3 lands, although it would be much slower card, more relegated to control shells and aggressive Delver decks. The only other realistic way of reining in Gush's power would be to remove its alternative cost altogether, and find some other way of differentiating it from divination. Next is Gitaxian Probe. This sorcery costs 1 Phyrexian in blue mana, which can be paid with 1 blue mana or 2 life. It allows you to look at target player's hand, then draw a card. It was also banned in May of 2019. Why was Gitaxian Probe banned? Pauper has access to some of the most powerful cantrips in Magic, such as Brainstorm. Gitaxian Probe beats out these all-star cantrips by technically not costing any mana. In almost every instance, Gitaxian Probe will be cast for 2 life, freeing up your mana to cast something like the other cantrips in your deck. It also provides free hand information, and while it doesn't let you interact with your opponent's hand, the free information allows you to play around their best cards, or know what to hold your counter magic for. Gitaxian Probe replaces itself with a card, doesn't cost any mana, and lets you know every card your opponent currently has. Other cards that replace themselves for free have seen play in multiple formats due to essentially allowing your deck to functionally have less cards in it. Probe offers that with an upside, leading it to arguably being the most powerful cantrip ever printed. It's banned to this day in Modern and Legacy and also restricted in Vintage. Given the power blue decks in the format, Wizards chose to hit Gitaxian Probe without hitting any more of the other fair cantrips that actually cost mana. These bans were leveraged surrendering the power of Delver without actually killing the deck. Considering that you didn't even have to be playing a blue deck to run Gitaxian Probe, however, its problems in the format extended far past Delver. Any deck in Pauper that could afford to lose a life could run Gitaxian Probe before its banning. While not every deck would want to play Gitaxian Probe, it would be easily included in several decks to this very day. Could Gitaxian Probe be unbanned? The answer to this is no. Pauper has no shortage of powerful blue spells, and Delver, the deck Gitaxian Probe was banned in part to hit, is still competent and viable to this day. With access to Ponder and other 1-mana cantrips, Pauper already has cantrips quality on par with Legacy for the most part, and with Gitaxian Probe would genuinely have more access to powerful cantrips than Vintage. While Pauper has less payoffs for these cards, there's no good reason to let Gitaxian Probe off the list when Pauper has plenty of powerful cantrips without it. How could Gitaxian Probe be fixed to be unbanned? Probe being a free spell is what pushes it too far. If it costs even just 1 generic and 1 Phyrexian blue mana, this spell would still be quite strong. Arguably too good for Pauper, but far less overtuned than what it currently is. Another option is remove the handpeak option altogether and reduce the card to just a cantrip for 1 Phyrexian mana. While this would remove a key mechanic of the card, the lack of free hand knowledge would make the card simply an efficient cantrip and not always a way to gather information. Changing the Phyrexian blue mana to just a normal blue mana in the cost would also limit the card to only being playable in decks that actually are able to cast blue spells. It would also limit Delver's turn 1 plays to either a cantrip or playing a creature, instead of doing both thanks to Probe being free. The last card of these Delver-oriented bans is Daze. This instant costs 1 generic and 1 blue mana, but could also be cast by returning an island you control to your hand instead of paying its mana cost. Daze counters target spell unless its controller pays 1 generic mana, and the card was banned in May of 2019. Why was Daze banned? Of the 3 cards hit in May of 2019, this was the one most specifically powerful in Delver. These Delver of Secret decks are built to protect their namesake 1-drop, meaning that on their first turn, after tapping out to cast that Delver, they're the most vulnerable. Daze allows you to counter any 1-mana removal spell they might have had without having any mana held up. While you'd be behind on mana going forward, you protected your threat and were able to keep applying pressure on the next turn. Of course, this was far from the only application for Daze. Much like with Gush, it essentially being a free spell made it a potent option for many decks to be able to run it. Force Spike by itself is an underwhelming card, but in the early game if your opponent is playing their mana curve optimally, you'll have multiple chances to catch a key spell with Daze. Combo decks often rely on casting multiple spells a turn, and sometimes just genuinely don't have the extra mana to spare. But these combo decks could also use Daze to try and insulate their plays, since bouncing the land wouldn't matter much if the play wins you the game. Much like Gush and Gitaxian Probe, this was a card that was a problem in multiple decks, but helped prop Delver decks up as the undisputed best deck in the format. Each of the 3 helped Delver escape from tight spots, and were banned to help make the deck less reliant and more prone to counterplay. Could Daze ever be unbanned? The answer to this is no. Since Daze's banning, not only has Delver remained relevant, but more decks have entered the format which might use Daze. Multiple combo decks exist in the format that could use Daze to insulate their plays. While it's arguably the most likely to be unbanned of the trio, its ability to protect Delver when it should otherwise be shield down makes it a tough sell. Delver's mana efficiency makes it hard to fully combat, and Daze push that even further. And even though a 2 mana force spike isn't ideal, it's still fairly efficient as far as spells go, and not impossible to hardcast and still find value even in the first few turns. How could Daze be fixed to be unbanned? As with Gush, changing the effect to need to bounce an untapped land would drastically limit the card's effectiveness. Delver would no longer be able to protect their turn 1 play, yet Daze would still find some marginal use in the early to mid game. Other changes wouldn't do much to fix the card, since the actual counter effect is already somewhat weak, but a weak counter spell is still fairly strong when it's free. Maybe if it needed to tap more lands, it could be more fair. That's another way to prevent it from being so good so early, but would still give it plenty of play in the mid to late game given how Gush's cost of 2 lands was manageable in practice. Alright, and that's the video. The next video will go over more cards that had time to become established as part of Pauper's metagame before eventually getting banned, as well as a type of mechanic that has proven to be problematic for Pauper multiple times.